Hi, this is Anthony Parent, and today we're going to be discussing how to choose a tax preparer if you have international affairs, whether you're a U.S. expat overseas or whether you're an expat in the U.S. with things around the world. You have some difficult tax work to be done, and there's some really important things you need to know. Joining me today is John Richardson, and John runs citizenshipsolutions.ca, and he has been a fantastic guest and on the forefront of some meaningful reform. And John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi.
And also Keith Redmond. Keith runs American Expatriates 2.0 on Facebook, so you can find him there. He has about, 6,000 subscribers now?
We actually are up to 6,600 subscribers.
Oh, that is
200 new subscribers in the past week.
Oh my God, that's amazing. All right, so this will be going on. This will be going on that channel too, so they'll see that. So the first thing is what people don't understand, this is the number one thing people need to understand. When you file your taxes, no matter who you hire, you as a taxpayer are always ultimately on the hook. There isn't one expert you can hire to say, don't penalize me. I hired this expert. Don't penalize me. You are always on the hook. So that's the thing you need to understand. No matter what representations made to you are, no matter how impressive this person is, if they're wrong, you'll be the one paying the price. Now, it's true, you might have grounds for penalty abatement, but if you know how the IRS works, getting a penalty abatement on reasonable grounds, the IRS can be incredibly unreasonable, and especially when you get to some of the international forms that you may have heard about, Form 5471, Form 3520A. These forms, the IRS is absolutely ridiculous about penalty assessments on, so you have to be overprotective. So let's start with it now. Let's talk about some of the options that people have. Now, I think one of the options people have is they could just do it themselves, right? You have TurboTax, you have a bunch of different, you have Free File. So why don't we talk about that? John, what do you think about some of the do-it-yourself options? And what kind of people would that be good for?
I think that the do-it-yourself option should be explored by almost everybody at first, because they'll begin to learn some of the things that they do know, some of the things they don't know, and get a better sense of what it is they'll need help with. I would just start with the IRS Free File page. It's fairly mainstream. I think that people can determine very, very quickly whether they need additional help. But I would add to that they really ought to read IRS Publication 54, which is aimed at Americans abroad and green card holders, which in a general sense describes what really is a different kind of tax system for Americans abroad. But yeah, I mean, everybody, and I've also said many times that in the long run, given the complexity of the U.S. tax system and the cost of filing, I suspect that the people who are going to be able to retain U.S. citizenship are those who learn how to do their own taxes, or at least understand what it means.
I think that's fantastic advice, because you do run into roadblocks very quickly with the Free File. As soon and this is something that I've run sample prompts through H&R Block software. I've used other prompts. I would try to throw things in there to sort of see where it would throw errors in. And as soon as you have a foreign corporation, any business overseas, you really don't want to start doing this yourself. But I agree that Publication 54, it is dense, it is not that fun, but it is actually packed with some of the most important information. And if you actually do read Publication 54, you'll become one of the foremost experts on international taxation, and you'll be in a better position than anybody else to say, wait a second, I think this person's full of it. And it's really, really common, because this is the thing. We have a domestic tax system, and then sort of the international part is tacked on. And nearly 99% of tax preparers only know that domestic portion. And so people will think, well, oh, there's just an international portion. It's another thing. But it's another world. I mean, it's really another world. Now, Keith, what have you found people do it themselves? Any issues coming up there?
A lot of people with whom I deal really don't do it with themselves, but those who do are only the ones that have a very simple profile, that may have just an income that falls below the foreign earned income exclusion. They don't have any mutual funds. They don't have any type of extra savings aside from maybe a savings account at a local bank where they live, and that's it. Everyone else really goes to a U.S. tax compliance professional because they're just so afraid of making some type of error because of the complications that are involved, as you just stated. So it's somebody that really just has a very, very simple profile who may do it on their own.
Yeah, I would say so. Someone who has a simple profile, the return's basically the same every year. They're just the numbers change a little bit, but there's no additional forms. Yeah, I don't really know if it's really worth it to. And we've encountered some fantastic tax preparers along the way who help out some people with lower incomes, and that's a big issue overseas too. People want to be in compliance, and it gets really hard to do that because you're looking for someone who could do it correctly and at a price you can afford, and that's kind of hard to meet sometimes. But actually, one issue that comes up a lot is you can have a U.S. expat overseas who's working for a large company, let's say Microsoft, and Microsoft hires a firm, maybe a Big Four accounting firm, to handle your tax prep as an employer, sort of a benefit. Whether you're in the U.S. happens a lot of visa holders in the U.S. working in New York City, they have the Big Four, their company does the returns. Now, this is what I know from talking to my friends who do work for the Big Four. These contracts make it so the tax preparer can't spend the time they want to on the return. That they say, okay, you have 4 hours to work on this return for this client, and that's all the contract allows you. Now, as soon as you get into one form of 5471, that taxpayer is in a horrible position because like 4 hours isn't enough to fill that form out correctly. So a lot of taxpayers who work at the CPAs who work for his Big Four, they are actually really uncomfortable preparing a lot of these returns. Because they don't have the ones who are good, no, they don't have the time to really be as thorough as they wish. And then on the other hand, and this is something that we're seeing a lot of, the Big Four is actually outsourcing a lot of their work to India, and there's some problems sort of integrating there. I think they're getting better, but there's some really bad returns we've been seeing coming out of there at the subcontracting. So that's something you really need to be worried for. I think that's my point. There's no firm that will guarantee and this is including of my firm too. There's no firm that can guarantee nothing will happen. It just can't. Something can happen. Right. And the way that we handle that is because it's just when we look at what our clients are faced against and everything and all the pressures, what we do is we offer audit protection. When we file a return for someone, we stand by our work and we'll protect that audit. So if anything comes up down the road, and we know what the IRS's issues are. So it's
Anthony,
we're able to do.
Is it the case that if somebody's, say, working for a multinational overseas and the company pays for their tax return to be done, that's a taxable benefit, isn't it, to the Correct. Employee?
That is, but you know what? Yeah, that is, but I know they're not including that as income.
They're not, I see.
Yeah, okay. That's kind of funny. So there it is.
No, because I mean, it's incredible because the tax cost of having these people do it theoretically can be far higher than they might have to pay elsewhere.
Absolutely. Right. And so the contracts usually, they're trying to shoot for about a $1,500, $2,000 return for a lot of their clients. Now, for some of the clients, that's easy, no problem. But what if someone comes into the U.S. with a foreign retirement plan? Very common, right? Someone has a business background, very common. So those are the things that really, and there's a lot of people very, very uncomfortable with the constraints that they're put under. So it's now let's talk about some of the red flags.
Yes.
Keith, why don't you start with us? So some red flags that you would say, wait a second.
Well, I think one key red flag that I get from a number of people who do contact me is that they get scared by some of these U.S. tax compliance professionals where they're really putting the screws to them that they need to comply now. Otherwise, the IRS is going to come after them in their countries of residence, and that they get very scared. And I know that sounds a bit hyperbolic, but I have seen this time and time again. And that's one red flag for me, is that if somebody is that pushy, to go after these people, I always say stay away and go find somebody else, because you don't need somebody who is going to be putting the screws to you to comply now. That's one red flag. Another red flag is that I've also seen where the U.S. tax compliance professional, and no lie, this has happened, where they automatically state that the American overseas must get into the OVDP program, and they don't even bring up the other programs that are available. I've seen that time and time again. And again, I state to those individuals, that's wrong. You need to stay away from that U.S. tax compliance professional and seek advice elsewhere.
That is very true. Yeah, I mean, I think we've all seen, John, you've seen this too, people pushed into programs that just absolutely were completely inappropriate. Thing is once you go into one of those programs, you really can't get out. You're stuck. So there's something you really want to make sure when you're, this is where, and this is something where I think where might segue nicely into a discussion about sort of the different roles of tax attorneys, CPAs, enrolled agents, sort of where you would want, what kind of person you're looking for. And
exactly. And if I may interrupt for a second, Anthony, another question I always get is, how do I know whether I need to use a CPA, or how do I know if I need to use a tax attorney? I don't know. I'm not sure. So that kind of lends itself to what you're about to speak about. So, John, what would you say is a time where you would want to use a tax attorney?
Well, first of all, I would not use an attorney to file returns in the sense of filling out the returns. But where I think a tax lawyer can be enormously helpful is in helping somebody decide what the contents of the return should be. For example, not all business entities, even if they're legally corporations in other countries, are corporations under the U.S. entity classification rules. Is something really a trust, etc.? And, for people with, for many, these are just normal American abroad types of issues. I think that it can be worth getting an independent, evaluation or thoughts, or at least identify the questions to ask on what the contents of the return should actually look like. I think that you're probably better off using a lawyer for that. You're probably better off using somebody who is not ultimately going to file the returns, as well. So there's no, sort of conflict of interest. I mean, that would be my view of where a lawyer can be most valuable. I also think a lawyer can be valuable on, the question of, for non-compliant people, what's the best way to come into compliance? Fortunately, Keith was mentioning OVDP, and fortunately that type of program doesn't exist anymore. What does exist is stuff that's more reasonable, more benign. But nevertheless, I think that's a role that lawyers, I think, can play. That they probably do a little better than most accountants do.
And I would say this, I think, for attorneys, you and I, we don't mind pushing, we don't mind arguing. We don't mind making the IRS feel uncomfortable. The tendency that I've seen with CPAs is they kind of want to get along with the IRS a little bit more. And that's just a general rule, because there's other CPAs that do act very much like attorneys. I find that it's really good to have a team. That's why we have attorneys and CPAs, because the CPA has one perspective and the attorney has another one. And together, usually where you find a CPA and a tax attorney agreeing, you might have your right answer.
Well, or at least not a wrong answer.
Yeah, right. A good answer, right? Yeah. Who knows if it's actually right, but at least it's a good answer. We have any other red flags that you guys can think of?
Well, I think that one obvious issue here is whether I think clearly you've got to be dealing with somebody who does this kind of work. I'm not suggesting I think this work is necessarily harder than other kinds of work. I don't, but I think it's a very specific kind of work with a fairly long learning curve. And I think it's it's apparent very quickly whether this is something that somebody does or not. I think generally in selecting a tax preparer, you've got to think long term. Is this somebody who I want, part of my life? going forward for a number of years. So I think there's also, personality issues and that sort of stuff.
And I think another key issue that certainly comes up in the questions that I get is it better to use a CPA or tax attorney outside the United States where they may be more savvy on the foreign aspect of this versus using someone who is in the United States? I get that question quite a bit. What do you gentlemen think about that in regards to an answer?
Yeah, I think the location of where your preparer is irrelevant to their competency. Now, maybe you want someone local because you prefer to meet someone in person, but there is no, just because a person's local doesn't necessarily make them better. Just because someone's remote doesn't necessarily make them better. It's really, I would say that's not, and I think there is a tremendous amount more, there's a move from people sort of doing that in-person interview H&R Block style to now people are a lot of things, and we're seeing all over the place, a lot of firms, and we're doing this too. Very few of our clients actually have a step foot in our office. We're able to do a lot of things remotely, and it does allow you to sort of grab a little bit more expertise. You're really able to get someone who does these issues all the time and is familiar with the treaty of the country you're into too, and that's always something that if you do have treaty issues, that's a red flag right there, the treaty issues. If you have someone who is saying something to say, we have this special way to treat something through some treaty thing, and you're reading it and you can't find anyone else in the world that's agreeing with this person, and you can't find the exact thing, you really might want to be careful about that, because we've seen this time and time again that it's so easy to promise something with the IRS, because when the problem erupts, it's going to be years later, and I don't know if that person is exactly going to be wrong. So you got to be careful of some of the promises. When someone makes it seem a little bit too easy, that concerns me, because this is actually the hardest thing. This is the hardest tax compliance to do. International taxation is by far the hardest compliance out there, and the consequences are incredibly hard. And I think that's another thing I want to talk to is the time that if you have these international things, don't look at this as a domestic return. These, the fees for return, and I think what I see for, what we see for fees for these are anywhere between $800 to $12,000, $15,000 a year, depending on what's really involved. And that is one thing. So if someone's making it sound too easy, watch out. If they make it sound too hard, watch out.
Well, let me ask you this question. Is it more advantageous for an American overseas, let me use France as an example. The American overseas lives in France. Is it more advantageous to have someone as their U.S. tax compliance professional who also does French tax compliance, where they know the nitty-gritty of the U.S.-France tax treaty? Is it better to go to somebody like that versus having two separate tax compliance professionals, one for France and one for the U.S.? Does that make sense, my question?
It does. I mean, the issue is that no matter what country's tax system we're talking about, it's a piece of cake. It's easy. I don't care what country we're talking about, that tax system is easy. If you can handle U.S. international taxation, you can handle any other country's tax system. It's quite easy because it grabs, there's very similar elements and things. It's just not as complicated because other countries are interested in raising revenue, whereas the United States is interested in whatever. I don't know what it's about. Here's, John, I thought of a term for you. Tax vandalism. That's what we have here. This is tax vandalism because there's no purpose to it. Here's a bunch of forms you have to fill out. We don't get the IRS doesn't get the revenue, but it creates a bunch of busy work. So it's like you're just vandalizing things. Now you got to clean up the vandalism. It doesn't really accomplish anything. So that's
Anthony, the whole Internal Revenue Code is, I think, an act of political vandalism.
Yeah, right. Love it. Anything we want to add here, guys? I think we got everything wrapped up. What do you think is important to finish up?
Well, I have a possible closing thought here, and it's really related to Keith's question. I think that it's worth pointing out there's a difference between what I would call cross-border tax person, somebody who does just say U.S. taxes or something like that. And I think the people who have issues domestically, locally, where they live, that are complicated, unusually complicated for a particular year, and it's unclear how they'll impact on U.S. foreign tax credit rules and things like that, probably should find, this is a case where I think they probably should find somebody who can do both the local and the U.S. taxes, so that, doing the best you can and say country A doesn't hurt country B, or that type of thing. So, but it's a problem. I mean, the best thing is to probably not be an American citizen. Life is complicated as an American, Anthony.
It sure is. Well, hopefully we offered some help to people who are looking to get their taxes done properly. It can be done. I guess we're scaring you a little bit. We're alerting you. Maybe not scare Martin. We're
actually. Can I raise one more thing here?
Absolutely.
I'd be interested in your thoughts. And we talk about the different kinds of people. So lawyers and not for tax preparation. By the way, just for your listeners, I am not a tax preparer in any way, shape, or form. Okay, just so people know that. All right. The CPAs we've talked about. We didn't really talk about enrolled agents. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the difference between an enrolled agent and a CPA, for example.
Well, enrolled agents, you could become an enrolled agent in two ways. You could be an ex-IRS employee, enrolled agent that way, or you can become an enrolled agent by taking the test. The test is pretty beefy, but guess what? It's not really heavy on.
International.
Right. No, the hardest thing. You have individual. There's an individual component, and that's moderately difficult. You have a business component, which is difficult, and then you have a representation portion, which to me is the easiest part. But that's probably because I'm an attorney. Those are the three parts to it. If you go through it, there's very little. It really glosses over the large issues of it. So somebody's an enrolled agent, so they can do it. Now, if they have the experience, well, then they can be very good. We have enrolled agents who work for us, and they're fantastic. They can be very, very great. Some of the best taxpayers can be enrolled agents, and this is the thing that people don't understand about CPAs. CPAs aren't really tax specialists. What is it? There's 5 parts to the CPA exam, and only one of them, one or two of them is taxation. CPAs are accountants. That's what they are, certified public accountant. A lot of that CPA test is on accountancy, following the rules. And so it's not necessarily related to tax. And so you can have someone who's a fantastic CPA, but that they might not be the tax genius that you assume them to be, because they just might be an accounting genius.
And even if they're a tax genius, it's very unlikely to carry over to international tax. Very unlikely. One other thought on this is that I think that these different kinds of tax people learn tax differently. I mean, I think as a lawyer, you probably learn tax from the code on down.
Yes.
Reading the Internal Revenue Code. I'm not sure that, that this is more just a comment. It's not a criticism, but I don't think enrolled agents learn it from the code. I think the ones I know anyway, they tend to learn it more from the
study guide,
et cetera, on up, and the CPAs are somewhere in between. So, if you're dealing with a complex problem, right, I think that you need somebody who thinks in terms of what the code actually says.
Exactly right. And the way that lawyers are trained to think about the tax is that we challenge the first part of your federal income tax class will be a case like, hey, here's a test of whether or not something's income. Is this really income that's subject to tax? And so that we sort of start with a challenge immediately. Is this even income? Whereas a CPA is just going to assume, this is how we just fill out this form according to what the IRS says. We say, well, is what the IRS saying even right? Can that stand a constitutional challenge? So that's sort of the way that we approach it a little bit differently. Just looking at sort of the authority of the IRS to do things, and their and giving pushback, and there's a lot more than just advocacy. We really look at the underlying assumptions the IRS is making.
Well, I think it seems to me, Anthony, that part of the goal here is to have as few forms as possible, right, in it. To have the stuff that should be there, and not go to town with things that are sort of speculative. I mean, like there's an awful lot of forms in the U.S. tax system, and you want your life to consist of as few of them as possible, I think, right?
Less forms are better, and you want to make sure you don't overfile too, and that's something that you always have to. We've talked about this before. There's a risk of underreporting and also overreporting, and sometimes when someone's far too protective, they're actually putting you more at risk.
I agree. I agree absolutely. I mean, that whole 3528 debacle, this past year, just extraordinary, and I think strongly supports that view, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Yeah, I think if I may interject for.
Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just would like to interject something for a second before we wrap up this call, this podcast, because I think it's a very informative podcast. That if I may be forward enough to suggest, Anthony, that those individuals who are listening to this podcast, if they have any further questions in regards to what they've heard on this podcast, that they pose these questions on your IRSMedic YouTube on the YouTube page underneath this podcast, because it may warrant that we need to do another podcast or a series of podcasts to address some of these questions for Americans overseas.
Thank you, Keith. Absolutely. Please, because we might not be hitting the issues that's really important to you right now. So please leave those in the comments below. We do look at every comment, and we've got a lot of great ideas for future videos. So please respond, and we enjoy. And we do have a fantastic following of other professionals on here. And I mean, we get some fantastic questions. So there are really, really some awesomely talented people out there. And we just hope you can find one that's good for you. So thanks for joining us today. For John, Richardson, and Keith Redmond, this is Anthony Parent of IRSMedic.com. Please subscribe. We'll have some more updates coming on. And John and Keith are always around to help us out. Thanks for watching.